Okay, so I think we can start. And I see that you already have some people in the chat. So hi, everyone. My name is Ahmadou, and we are very lucky today to have a really interesting talk about Twitter data. So it's, I think, the first webinar after the YR conference. I think it was really an awesome conference, and I hope we have the time to talk about that. So today we are very lucky to have Suhem Parack. He's a senior developer advocate at Twitter, and he focuses on really helping academic researcher and community to really succeed on using Twitter data. So he will show us some exciting new stuff about Twitter data, particularly using R. So please try to follow. And if you want to ask him question, he's available on Twitter at Suhem Parack. So Suhem, the floor is yours, and people from the chat, if you want to ask question, please ask on the live chat, and I think at the end we try to answer. So the floor is yours, please. Go ahead.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. I'm going to try and share my screen. Just let me know if you're able to see it, and then I think we'll be good to get started. So are you able to see my screen?
Yes, I think we can see it.
Oh, you're able to see it? I think there's like a lag. All right, I think you guys are able to see my screen. So yeah, my name is Suhem Parack. I'm a developer advocate at Twitter. I focus on the academic research community, which means that I get to help professors, students, and researchers that are doing research specifically with Twitter data. Then I try and help them understand what Twitter data is, how can they get Twitter data, what kind of tools and libraries are out there that they can use when they want to do their analysis and research with Twitter data. And so if you ever have questions about the Twitter API, then you can always reach out to me on Suhem Parack. That's my Twitter handle. And I'm always happy to answer questions about Twitter and how you can use their data for academic research. And I'm super excited to be here to talk to you about getting started with Twitter data in R. So for this webinar, what we'll do is we'll first talk about what Twitter data is, right? So we'll understand what kind of data Twitter provides, what format is it in, and so on, what topics and things like that. Then we'll talk about what it's used for. So we'll discuss a few use cases on how people today are using Twitter data. And for this webinar, we'll keep it in the context of academic research, like what kind of research people can do, or like what topics people use, because Twitter data is also used by professors in a classroom setting, right? So they'll use it to teach people like data science concepts or like text mining concepts and things like that, ML concepts. And so they'll use Twitter data, for example, for building models and things like that. And we'll get into those things in just a bit. So that's what we'll cover after that. And then we'll actually talk about how to get Twitter data. By that, we'll actually be talking about what are the APIs that Twitter provides for people to get Twitter data. Because unlike many, like a lot of like researchers are used to getting data as like CSV, downloaded entire data set, and then they like import it in R or like in Python and they start using it. But Twitter, obviously, because it's a developer platform, then Twitter makes the data available via APIs. And those APIs you get back as like response JSON and things like that. Then you like import it in R or Python, and then you start to work with it. So we'll talk about what those APIs are. And then finally, we'll do few examples of like getting started in R. So like, how do you get tweets about a certain user? How do you get tweets about certain topic? How can you remove like, or get only tweets about, for example, if you wanted only tweets in English, or you only wanted tweets with images in them and things like that. How do we do all of those things? We'll discuss those. And then finally, I'll point you guys to some resources that we can then, like when in your free time, when you want to start using Twitter data yourself, how you can go about doing research with Twitter data or like getting started. So first and source, what is Twitter data, right? So Twitter data is basically data that Twitter makes available through its APIs. About things that people are talking about on Twitter, right? So any tweet that's like made publicly, so any public tweet that a person makes about, let's say, the current like California fires, or like anything in general, like political events, social events, things like that. Those are basically posted as tweets. So when you go to twitter.com, you see the tweets in your like a timeline, and you see who that tweet is from, when that tweet was made, and things like that. But this data is then made available through APIs for people to study and analyze and understand the world around them, right? So a few examples would be like people from like different like humanities, or like people from like social sciences, people from computer science, things like that. They use Twitter data to do a variety of like studies on Twitter data, right? So you'll have, for example, journalists. They would want to study like spread of misinformation, for example, or they would want to understand how content spreads on Twitter, things like that. And then you might have people who might be interested in studying specific topics like Hurricane Harvey, for example, or the California wildfires and things like that. All of those things, then people will get this Twitter data and they'll study this data for all the public tweets that are made. So next, this is like a example of some of the use cases, right? So like first one I mentioned was like spread of misinformation. So you'll have researchers who are like experts in the field of like studying misinformation and so on. And then they'll get the Twitter data by connecting to the APIs, getting it back, and then they'll do their own research and analysis on understanding, okay, how information generally spreads, and the different models around misinformation, things like that. Another example is climate change, for example, right? So if somebody wanted to study like tweets around climate change and so on, then they could get Twitter data and then they could do their analysis on it. Similarly, classification, sentiment analysis. So sentiment analysis meaning like whether like, like some brands, they want to understand how the perception of their products is. So then what they'll do is they'll do sentiment analysis on these tweets, and they'll have tools. Some people will do custom sentiment, or like they'll build like custom models to do that, whereas some people will use like existing third-party tools and libraries to do this kind of like sentiment analysis and like how their brand is being perceived. And then like I mentioned, in some cases, people are using Twitter data to like teach in a classroom setting. So there'll be like a class on like introduction to data science or machine learning 101, something like that, where they want to show basic like, okay, how do you make visualizations? How do you do data wrangling? How do you like clean data sets and things like that? All of those are like cases that people use Twitter data for, right? So actually, before we get into what API Twitter offers, I'll point you to like an interesting resource. If I go to developer.twitter.com, in here you see in solutions, there is this thing called academic research. So this is actually a good resource for like, if you wanted to like follow up later on, like, okay, I spoke about some use cases, but then what are some other use cases that people may have been like using Twitter data for? So you can see we have some researchers spotlights showcasing, okay, how the Hate Lab at Cardiff University, or like the Center for Digital Health at Penn Medicine, how they used Twitter data. Similarly, what other things people study, like the Me Too movement, migration, and then the SOS Harvey, which is about the Hurricane Harvey and so on. So this is like a good resource, developer.twitter.com/en/solutions. Actually, if you just go to developer.twitter.com and under solutions, you'll see an academic research and get inspired. You'll see few examples of like what other, like if you're interested in doing long-term Twitter, like research with Twitter data, then what you can do with it. So going back to the presentation, actually here, this one, right? So what APIs does Twitter offer, right? So like I mentioned earlier, that like you don't get like a CSV file directly from Twitter that, hey, this is a CSV file about, let's say, like California wildfires, and you just like put it in and you start analyzing. That's not how it works. Instead, what Twitter does is it makes data available through APIs, right? So you'll have a bunch like different APIs. I'll talk about each of these, but essentially what that means is that these APIs then let you like you can make an HTTP call to one of our APIs, okay? And then you'll specify a certain thing. So let's say you want tweets on a certain topic, or you want all the tweets for a certain user, or you want certain tweets that contain only certain keywords and things like that. Then you can use different APIs that are available, right? So let's talk about one at a time, and then obviously, like after this, we're going to get into examples of each of these, how to like implement these APIs in R. So the first one is the standard API, which is like our older API. So when you see 1.1, whenever somebody says, oh, this is a v1.1, this basically means the standard API, which is like supported in your R tweet library in R, for example. And this, the examples of like endpoints that are in this API are like status is filter, right? So status is filter, for example, if I want a stream of tweets constantly. So let's say today I go right now and like I make a tweet about the debates, right? And so if I had a keyword set in my like filter here, looking for all tweets about the debate, then as those tweets are happening, I'll start to get those tweets as they happen, right? So that's the statuses filter, which is like a streaming endpoint. So you stream tweets as they're happening. So it's more for like data collection and more for things that are like being talked about right now, right? Because there's no historical concept, meaning if you use statuses filter endpoint, you can't go back in time and say, okay, give me tweets from a week ago on this topic, right? Because it's only like, it's getting tweets that are happening right now. Whereas if you look at the next endpoint, the search tweets, for example, would be an example of a historic, what we would call historical endpoint. So let's say if you wanted to get back data from the last 7 days. So let's say 7 days ago, you wanted to get tweets about the Lakers and the Miami Heat game, right? So then what you could do is you could use this endpoint, and then you could type in certain keywords by saying that, okay, give me tweets about Lakers. Maybe you want to use the hashtag for like hashtag like Lakers, something like that. And then you'll get historical data, which is different from this filter endpoint, which was giving you data as it's happening. So let's use more for like historical analysis. Like if you wanted to go back in time and study, okay, there was an event, how do I understand the tweets about it? Then you'd use that. And then a few other examples is like, one is statuses show. Actually, statuses show is a good one to point out, because a lot of researchers, what they'll do is, let's say I collected tweets on a certain topic, right? So I collected all tweets about like Hurricane Harvey. Now, if I want to share these tweets with another academic, right? So if there's another professor at a certain university doing research, and I want to be like, hey, I want you to like peer review my like data and see what you think, like what might be like missing in it and so on. So you actually can't just give them all the data you downloaded from Twitter, okay? Because that's against our policy. So the developer policy requires that if you want to share Twitter data with somebody else, then what you'll do is you'll give them only the tweet ID. So you'll give them, let's say, a list of like 1 million tweet IDs, right? And then what the other researcher or professor then he'll do is he'll rebuild, like for each of those tweet IDs, then he'll call this endpoint called statuses show, the statuses show endpoint. And then, and obviously we'll get into examples of this, but then he'll build the data set on his end, you see? And the whole motivation behind that is because in order to use the Twitter API, you obviously need to have a developer account. So if you don't have a developer account, you can't get, like we don't know who you are and what intention you have, whether you're going to comply with the developer policies and actually use Twitter data for the right research and things like that. And so for those reasons, then you can't just like take a data set, download it like with the actual tweet text and all of that. Instead, you'd pass them the tweet IDs. So this is the old Twitter API. And then there's another set of APIs. We won't be talking about this one today, but like the premium and enterprise. So like if you're like a large scale, like university and research institute, and you want like more data, right? Because if you see this search tweets only gives you last 7 days worth of data. But what if you wanted data from like, let's say 3 years ago, right? Then in that case, you would use something like this full archive search endpoint that lets you go back in time and get data from like a long time ago. And obviously those are like, because they're premium and enterprise, then they require like a subscription and so on. And then the last one is which is the most exciting one, is the new Twitter API. So now over the last year, now we've actually built out a new Twitter API, which is like much more improved over our 1.1, right? The standard one. And we're continuing to add more endpoints. So right now it has few endpoints like the sample stream, filtered stream, recent search, tweets and users, and so on. And if you look at, like, for example, a few examples is like in the recent search, again, it's equivalent of the search tweets where you'll get last 7 days of tweets, but obviously it has a lot of like new features that are not part of 1.1, right? So for example, we have this concept of what's called a context annotation that will be returned for a recent tweet payload. And what that does is it gives you contextual information about the tweet, right? So let's say there's a tweet about the Lakers, right? And it doesn't feature the word Lakers in it. So let's say somebody said, okay, LeBron James, he played really well against the Heat on such and such game, but actually it doesn't feature the word Lakers in it. Now with search tweets, if you were to just search for the word Lakers, then you will miss such a tweet, right? Because it's like, you will say, okay, it didn't have that word. Whereas contextually, you know that that tweet is like about the Lakers. And so then what this recent search, the power of that endpoint is then it will let you, it'll pull out those tweets even if they don't have the word Lakers in them, but because they're contextually about that topic, then you'll be able to like understand in more detail. So that means that you'll be using fewer search terms, but you'll have more quality data that you get back. And then tweets and users is equivalent of this one, status to show, where you actually go and build your data set. So I'll get into the actual implementation, but if there are any questions so far, I'm happy to answer those.
I think maybe what we can do, if it's okay for you, is just like you do the whole presentation, and I think people will just ask in the live chat.
Perfect.
And
yep, that's perfect.
I myself have a bunch of questions, so I'll keep them for the end of the talk. So I think you can continue.
All right, cool. So now, in order to first use the Twitter API, right? I'm gonna close this one for now. Yeah. So in order to first use the Twitter API, you need to apply for a Twitter developer account, right? And so the way that you do it, and obviously because I already have one, I can't showcase my own. So what you'll do is you'll go to developer.twitter.com/en/apply for access, right? So you'll apply for a developer account. It'll ask you a few questions, and by saying, okay, what do you intend to use this for, and so on and so forth. And once you apply, once you have access, then you'll be good to go, because then you'll have a developer portal where you can then go and create what we call an app, and then it'll give you keys. Because remember, if you want to connect to the Twitter API, you need the new one uses the OAuth 2.0 bearer token authentication. So you need an API key and API secret. So that way we know, okay, this call is coming from this certain person, and we understand how you're using the API, and that you're somebody's not abusing the API, and so on and so forth, right? So developer.twitter.com/en/apply for access. If you're watching this and if you don't have a developer account, I highly recommend creating one, because there's a lot of value in getting started with Twitter data, even if you want to do exploratory use cases. So if you want to learn how to build graphs and charts and understand, okay, how do I get tweets on a certain topic? All of those you can get here. So developer.twitter.com/en/apply for access, right? Once you have applied, now I'll bring in my other a window. So this is actually because I already have an account. When I will go to developer.twitter.com and my developer portal, then I'll get this view, okay? And in this view, if you see here, this is the new developer portal experience, by the way. So if I go here, you see here, it tells me create an app. So I can go ahead and create an app, right? So let's call it rtweet. Okay. Now, when I create, you see it gives me API key, API secret, bearer token. I'll copy these, and we should save them somewhere, because then we can, after that, we can start using these in our in order to connect to the API, right? So now this one, because I'll be using a different app, but this is just to demo that if you go to keys and tokens, you can actually see your API key, API secret. The new API, you can just supply or you can just get the bearer token directly from here if you want it, and then you'll be good to get started, right? And one thing is that if you're using the 1.1 of the API, which is the old one, obviously, my ideal suggestion to everybody is to go towards using the new API, because that's the future. Because eventually, hopefully, there'll be a time where you won't have a world of a 1.1 API. It'll be only everybody uses 2. The V2 endpoint. But in this specific one, right? In order for this demo, because we'll be using the rtweet library, then what we need to do is in your app, you will have to specify a callback URL, right? So you'll do HTTP 127.0.1 and then 1410. Because now once you add this, right, then you'll be able to actually authenticate one time and then get a token, and then the rtweet package that we'd use, it'll keep that token, and then you don't have to specify it again and again, and then you can just get started. Obviously, this is not required for the V2, but yeah. So once you have this, then what you'll do is in your code. Actually, let me bring my IDE now. Or yeah. So this is the RStudio. And in this, if I want to first authenticate, right? Actually, I made a video for this. So because my authentication is already done, and I don't want to show my bearer or my API keys here. So I'll actually play that just so that you understand how it's working. So if I go to, yeah, here. Or no, wrong window. Yeah. So if you see this one, I'll play it, and it'll actually show you real quick that how it works. So I specify the API key and the app name and the secret, And then what it'll do is that it'll authenticate for me and it'll get the token. So if I run this, take me to that, you see the callback URL that we specified. It took us there, and then, or where'd it go? And then it authenticated you. So then after that, you'll be good to get started. Then you don't have to like constantly keep specifying API key, API secret for 1.1. So now to get started, right? So let's start off with like few basic examples. Let's start with just getting tweets, right? So first thing, obviously, you'll have to install the R-tweet package. So let's say you wanted all tweets about, I know, let's say COVID, right? So let's do search, and then search tweets, and then you have to specify the keywords that you want, right? And then the number. So let's say I'll say by default, like I want 100 tweets. And in this is the search term. So let's say I want tweets, right? So what I can do is I could do like coronavirus or COVID or something like this, right? So actually for the purposes of this demo, let's just use one single hashtag. Let's use COVID, right? And N is basically the number of tweets that I want. So like you can have, because our tweet is like a library, then it'll allow you to get like more than like 100. But like if you were to make the actual API call, then you will get like 100 tweets, for example, right? And then let's say I want to not include retweets, right? So what I'll do is include RTs, then I'll do false. Because sometimes, you know, like there are retweets and those are considered as one new tweet. So what'll happen is that if you'll call this, then it might end up having a lot of tweets that like you'll be like, okay, I only want like single tweets and not necessarily like not necessarily retweets, right? So I'll assign it to this one, and then if we were to just like do a view on this, so let's take a look at what kind of data we can get back for this term. Okay, so if you see here, let's look at a few of these things, right? Because all of these things come in handy. One is like the user ID, obviously, of the person who tweeted it. The status ID is actually the tweet ID. So if I go to Twitter, right, each tweet has like a tweet ID associated with it, and you can like save. So remember when I told you guys that you can share only tweet IDs for like peer review? So those would be these. Then you will share these tweet IDs with your peer review and so on. And then they will get, for each of these tweet IDs, then they will call the Twitter API again, and they will get back the or they'll build the actual tweet object. Next,
Suhem,
yes.
Suhem, please, is it possible for you to increase the font in the code? If it's possible, please. I think it's a little bit small. Thank you.
Do you know, actually, like, don't know the shortcut for zooming. Let's see. Is it Command plus? Oh, yeah. Is this better?
Yeah, it's much better. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, so this is what I was talking about, right? The status ID that you can then use to build your tweet object. Let's see what else we get for this. So we get the screen name. So screen name is basically the username that for the person who made the tweet, and the source is where the tweet came from, and so on and so forth. So there are like a few other things like what hashtags are there. So this vector actually shows you, if you see that, what were the hashtags that were included, and so on and so forth, right? Now, if you notice one thing here, if you look at, actually, let's look at the tweets, right? So if you see the tweets are in like a different, various languages, right? So what if you wanted to like limit it to a certain language? So let's say you said, okay, you know what, for this research, I want all tweets in, I don't know, like Arabic, for example. So then what you can do is you'll use the code for that thing, and then you'll use lang. So lang is an operator. So the operator, and we'll get into like available operators, especially when we talk about the V2 endpoints. But this one, you'll say, okay, give me all tweets in Arabic. So actually, let's try and run this now to see if it works. Hopefully it should. Yeah, okay, perfect. So if you see now you're able to get like only tweets that are in the Arabic language. And again, like you can, if you wanted, you could like filter on your end as well, and like only exclude or like include tweets that you might be interested in. And so on and so forth. So that's like one example. Another example is like, what if I wanted to get like followers data, right? So for that, so followers is basically like the people that I am following on Twitter, right? So our Twitter has a method for, I think it's called get followers, and then I have to specify the name for it. So I'll use my Twitter handle. So let's do Suhem Parack. and then this, right? So this will give me all the followers. Now this method will give me all the, actually, let's call it something. So let's call it Suhem followers. Okay, so this will get me all my followers. But if you, this one only gives me the tweet ID or the followers user IDs, right? Now, what if I want to get the actual like info or like user information for these, right? Then what I can do is I think there's a lookup users. Yeah. And for this one, I'll pass the user IDs from this. Yeah, perfect. So user ID, and then I'll call it Suhem data. Okay. So this will get me all data for the users from the user IDs that I got from my followers, right? And maybe we can do a view on this one. So this is to like understand like topics around like what, like, you know, how a certain user, what kind of like followers they have and so on and so forth. So if I run this, hopefully this should bring it up. Yeah, perfect. So this is getting me the data for in the first step for Suhem Parack. It's getting me like 100 of my like top 100 followers. Then it'll assign it to this one, and then it'll look up for each of these user IDs. It gets me the data back. So if I look at the data here, you can see again similar information, the statuses, text, in reply to status ID, meaning that this tweet was made in reply to another tweet, which is like good, but like now the new Twitter API, when we get into the recent search example, actually now makes it easy for you to get the entire conversation. Because one of the big challenge with like the Twitter API 1.1 that we always heard from people was it's difficult to build the entire, because, you know, like some threads have like, I know, like hundreds of like tweets, right? And it's difficult to like rebuild that entire conversation. But now with the new Twitter API, we actually have a field which is called the conversation ID field. So you just specify just the conversation ID, which will be your like the status ID of the original tweet, and then that's it. You get the entire conversation back, which is like difficult to do in some of the other or with the 1.1 of the API. So that's another one. So we looked at getting tweets by a certain topic or a certain keywords, and we looked at followers. Actually, let's look at the one for looking up the statuses, right? So like, let's say you are a professor or like a student who wants to like use somebody's data set that or like tweets that people give you, right? So actually, let me get an example. So what I'll do is I'll get an example of like few tweet IDs, and I'll show you how to go from those tweet IDs to the actual Twitter data. So if I have these, what I'll do is I'll make a vector. So these are the tweet IDs that I want. Let's say my friend shared with me, and he's like, hey, this is what I collected for a certain topic. How do I get the actual Twitter data for this? Then what you can do is we'll assign it to a vector. So we can do, and in this, we can pass this. Okay. Let's assign it to, okay, let's call it statuses. Okay. Now, this our tweet actually has a method called lookup status, I think. Lookup statuses. Then I can pass it the statuses. Just this is fine. And then I'll also set the parse to true to get the full thing. And then let's call it statuses. Okay. So now what it's doing is that for these status IDs, meaning for these tweet IDs, then build the entire object for me, right? So now, if you notice, only people who will have access to the Twitter API will be able to build the tweet data set, you see? Because like if you didn't have access, then obviously this will give you a 401, basically, which will say that, okay, you're not authorized to like make this API call because you didn't have the Twitter or you didn't use your own API key. So remember, that's actually one of the key things, that you should always use your own developer, like the client key and secret in order to connect to the Twitter API. Let's do a view on this guy. Okay, so the tweet IDs as vectors, and then I'm passing it to the lookup statuses, and then let's run this. Okay, perfect. So these were I just like for the demo, I actually got my own tweet IDs. If you see, like these are like recent tweets that I may have made. The first one is on, yeah, here, perfect. So it'll give you information similarly, like what the tweet was about, the source where it came from, and some of the other things that we discussed, right? The URLs, expanded URLs, and things like that. So if you include a URL in the tweet, then you can get that information as well. So like some people will study that to like see how spam is circulated. So they'll see if the expanded URL, does it actually give you back like a 200 response, and what's included in it, what's the description of that page, and so on and so forth. Those are also things that people use to study from the Twitter data. So that's another example of using this RTweet library. And then we'll do one more example for our this one before going into the new Twitter API. So another one could be, let's do the timeline one, right? So if you want, so when you log into Twitter, you see like your tweet timeline, right, from like your profile. So if I wanted to get the timeline, fairly straightforward. I'll just rename this to like my timeline. And then I think it's like, or it's get timeline. Get timeline, perfect. And then I'll pass it. Let's do my own Suhem Parack. And if I want to, yeah, I can specify the number of tweets that I want as well. So I'll say just get me like 100 of my own timeline, and we can try and view what information, how you can get. So again, so far we saw how to get tweets just for like using certain hashtags and keywords. Then we looked at how do you actually get like followers information and like build the data set for the followers. Then after that, we looked at the hydrate. So this process of like going from tweet IDs to actually building the entire tweet object is actually called, a lot of people call hydration. So we looked at that. And then finally, getting the entire timeline. So if you see, this is my timeline from my personal profile. And this only includes like the top 100 examples, obviously. It includes like the created date, general things that we've seen so far. So yeah, that's the Twitter API 1.1 for reference. Again, this is like the old API. Eventually, we'll be moving all the endpoints to our new API, which is the V2. So, but this is still good enough for like people that want to get started with like analysis and like understand, like do plots over a period of time and things like that. It's still a good resource to use. The next thing is the V2 endpoint, and for this one I already have some code, because the thing is that the V2 endpoint is not supported in our tweet yet, right? Because it's such a new endpoint. Right now, you know how like here we were making like just calling the methods from the library and move, like that's it, right? But because like hopefully we'll get to a point where like popular R libraries will support the new endpoint, but because the new endpoint is not supported yet, then what we like we'll have to make the actual API call ourselves, right? So I'm using the HTTR library, and the way that this works is that in order to make obviously an HTTP call, you need to like specify certain headers, right? So headers. You also need to, for the header, you need like a bearer token, because it uses the 2.0 authentication. Bearer token requires that. And then you pass in like the actual URL that, okay, hit this, call this certain URL for me, and then get the data back, and like the parameters that we want. So a few things before we make the actual API call and like look at what's going on here, right? Is that by default, if you use the V2 of our Twitter API, then you'll only get the tweet ID and tweet text back, okay? You won't get all of the other information that we were seeing there, like where this tweet was, whether it's from a phone or like the web app and so on. All of those other extra fields, when was it created? All of those is not actually included by default. By default, you only get tweet ID and the tweet text. But if you wanted these additional fields, excuse me, then you pass those as parameters, right? So if you see here, in this example, I'm using 3 parameters, okay? Before that, let's look at this endpoint. So if I want to get tweets from the V2 endpoint, I have to make, and this one I'm using the recent search endpoint. So recent search will give me last 7 days of tweets, all tweets in the last 7 days. And so this is the path /2/tweet search recent. And then along with that, I need to pass a few parameters, right? So if you look at this one here, actually, let's start with max results, because that's an easy one, right? Max results is basically you're saying that for this API call, give me maximum 100 results, right? Because by default, you'll only get 10 back, but you're saying, okay, no, I want 100 back. That's easy. Next is the tweet fields, right? Now, if I want additional fields included for my tweet, right? So like, I just don't want just the ID and text. I want other things like context annotations, like conversation or like the language operator. When was it created? So on and so forth. So then I'll pass it a parameter for tweet fields. And then I'll also pass it those fields, right? So I'm saying created at lang, conversation ID, context annotation. Now, this is the good, like the fun thing, right? Now, this is where you'll actually specify your query, right? So actually, this was an example I wanted to give you of conversation ID, but before that, let's try something else, right? So if I wanted tweets about COVID, I could do like COVID or Corona and so on. Now, if you wanted to exclude any of the keywords, you can just put a hyphen before that. So if you wanted tweets with COVID but not Corona, then you can just put a hyphen. That means that give me tweets with COVID, not Corona in it. Okay, so that's a negation. Similarly, you can apply it at an operator level, right? So you can say, give me all tweets in English. So let's lang ing. What else? Let's say you want, you don't want retweets. So you'll do is retweet, right? And then you'll negate it. So if I did just is retweet, that means that give me tweets that are also a retweet. This would make it tweets that are not a retweet. And actually, let's try and run this one. So you can see that it gives you all the exact specific things, which like the precise things that you asked for. You asked for created at, you asked for the conversation ID, you asked for the tweet ID itself, which is obviously the same in this case, the text and lang and so on, right? Which is really good because we got a lot of feedback from people saying that by default in the 1.1 API, you give us back so many like fields that we never end up using. So we want more control. And the way that you get control over those fields is using this, right? So now, anytime you wanted any specific fields, you'll specify those here, and then you'll get those specific fields back. Now, one thing I spoke briefly about this earlier is if you look at this context annotations, right? If I click on this, you'll actually see that now this is telling me what the tweet is contextually about and what entities are present in it, right? So if you see, it has things like entity name. So like entity name, Donald Trump, entity name, Joe Biden, and so on. And then it'll tell me what this tweet is about as well. So like it's about like a politician, a person, so on and so forth. And so the good thing about this is that you could actually search for tweets just based on these entities, right? So even if the tweet didn't include the word Joe Biden or the word Donald Trump or something like that, right? You could still get that data or tweets included in your criteria without having to specify a lot of like those fields here. You see, so if I go back to this data, you'll see that because those names appear here, then like it understood it contextually about that. Similarly, we can look at this one, pink eye. So this is about an ongoing story, which is COVID-19. So you can see that the tweet is about COVID-19. So if I wanted to get tweets specifically by domain without using the keywords, then I can use the domain ID and the entity ID as the thing, right? So if I go back here, I'll copy this entity ID. And if I wanted, let's say, I don't want all of these terms. So what I can do is I can just say context and then 123 dot this, right? So if I go back here, just to clarify, or where to go? Yeah, you see 123 is the domain and entity ID is this. So I'm doing what domain ID dot entity ID. So I'm going to go ahead and close these actually. Yeah. So actually now if I run this one, you see now I got so many of these tweets. And even if they might not necessarily include the word COVID or in them, if they're like contextually about it, then you can get, or like if it has just the word like stay at home, for example, right? Or pandemic and things like that. And you know that it's contextually about COVID, then it's including. So this is actually a really powerful operator. Not a lot of people are aware of it, but like if you use this one, then you can get a lot like a specific detailed tweets. And obviously, if you feel like certain word keywords are missing, then you can always supplement them. So let's say for whatever reason in this topic, the keyword for stay at home was missing. So then you could still just supplement that. So you could have stay at home or like hashtag stay at home or something like that. And then it'll include that for you in your data set. So this is actually a really powerful one. And then the other one that I wanted to show is the conversation ID. So you can use conversation ID and then specify an example of the conversation. Actually, this one, let me see if I can find an example of a thread real quick on Twitter. Okay, perfect. So I think I found one. So let's try this one as an example. Right. So, and if I run this, you see like how many, like we got the entire thread back. Whereas like earlier, like if you didn't have like the other previous API does not support this conversation ID field, then what happens is like people have to go in and they have to like rebuild the entire thread by writing like custom logic that for if it contains the in reply to status ID, go make another API call and then make another API call and build that. But with the new endpoint, you don't have to like worry about any of those things. So this is actually pretty powerful. And this is just one example, right? So if I go back to my deck, this is just one example. The new Twitter API actually includes a lot more endpoints, right? So if you wanted to check it out, if you can go to developer.twitter.com, and if you go to docs, right, you'll see that the new API actually, so new API is under this Twitter API. So you see 1.1, this is the old one that we spoke about for using our tweet directly. But if you wanted to make the API call yourself and like make use of these like new fields, like the conversation ID and so on, you can actually see those here. And then you can see the new endpoint. So the one that we used was recent search, but there are other ones. There's a filtered stream endpoint. So it's basically a stream as tweets are happening right now. You can like filter and get like specific tweets that you can then collect. Similarly, lookup is to like look up tweets by tweet ID, the thing that we discussed in like for peer review and things like that. Then I actually wanted to point you to like few, I know we have like 3 minutes or so, but wanted to point out to like few specific additional resources. One is this one, right? So if you go to tweet annotations, then it will show you which topics you can get tweets by, right? So you see here, let's say somebody wanted all tweets about like politicians, right? So then they could use the annotation for this one instead of having to write like different politician names and like so on and so forth. This makes it so much easier for people to get started and get tweets that are contextually about a certain topic. And yeah, few other resources that I pointed here. One is if you don't have a developer account, then you should apply for access here, developer.twitter.com/en/apply for access. Second is this documentation. So the thing that I just showed you, let's say if you were like, hey, I actually want to learn more, how does this recent search endpoint work, right? So you can go to this recent search. If you look at the API reference, it'll actually show you what parameters you can pass to it, how many, what are the rate limits, like how many requests you can make in certain time, how do you like, which fields can you get back? You can actually get poll fields back as well. Like one thing that's like new about this endpoint or this new API is like it supports polls. So you know when like somebody has like a Twitter poll, like and gives you for like few options, and like once you've done with that, you actually don't like programmatically you were not able to get that data back. But now with the Twitter API v2, you're actually able to get this data back. So you're able to understand how like the options, when was the poll shut, and so on and so forth. You can get this information. And then also, if you look at the integrate section, this will actually point you to like the different operators that are supported. So let's say you were like, hey, okay, you showed me how to get the tweets in Arabic. What about like if I wanted some tweets in Japanese? So then what you'll do is you'll use this lang operator in your search, right? So where we were searching, meaning here, or this search thing, then you can do like lang, was it JA for Japan? Yeah. And then if you said, okay, I want tweets with images, right? So then what you can do is has images, right? And then you say, if you wanted like tweets that are only from verified account and so on, then you use these. So this will actually outline the different parameters that you can use, how to use exact phrases, meaning use quotes and so on. You can look for tweets from certain accounts. So if I say from, here, if I say from Suhem Parack, so this will get you tweets from my account that have like images and so on and so forth. So that's another good resource. That go to docs, and then under v2, you'll see, because it's early access, you'll see a lot of like good documentation. And then there's actually a research hub that I pointed you to. So if you wanted to learn about what more like other academics are doing with Twitter data and like what are some resources, so you can actually go to this link under Solutions Academic Research. In fact, we have some good resources here as well to get you started. So like if you wanted to like store Twitter data on like, for example, AWS and things like that, or how do you run the Python package in R and things like that to get Twitter data. Some guidance on filtering. So if you wanted to like get Twitter data, what are things to consider? How do you make sure that you have the right sample size of your data? How to filter out for noise and reduce bias in your Twitter data set? All of those things you'll find under, oh, the link's broken. But yeah, under this page. And then two other things is like this R-Tweet library that I use. It's the documentation link is here. Obviously, you can follow me on Suhem Parack or Twitter Dev is our team's handle. So we are always more than happy to answer questions. And then if you want to learn about these individual endpoints, then you can always go to our, like, we also have like a YouTube channel on which if you go to Twitter API v2, you'll see like different, like what's new, how to understand the tweet payload, the new endpoints and so on that you can learn about. So yeah, that's all that like I wanted to talk about. Obviously, there's much more. Like we can hopefully at some point do a more like detailed one on now that we know how to get the data for different things. How do we like build visualizations and graphs and things like that as well, and do more with the Twitter data. So I hope that that's useful to people, and that I hope that you'll apply for access, and also that you'll try out our V2, which is the new API, and provide us any feedback, how you like it. If you have any challenges, I'm always happy to answer and help you unblock on those.
Wow, that was really amazing. Really. So many new features in the API version 2 and so many questions, I think, in the chat. So I'm not even sure we have enough time for everyone. So I apologize in advance. So I will try to forward you all the question. And so the first question was like, is it mandatory to have a developer account, for example, like to have this new feature? So if you can tell us more about having
it is. Yeah, for sure. And the thing is that I don't know why like people are like afraid or apprehensive. Actually, it's a pretty standard process, because like anybody that like, let's say you wanted to use a certain product, then like you create, it's actually meant to help you. You see, like when you create a developer account, you'll be able to like make the most of the API by getting all the features, making the most of the benefits that you get with it. You're able to organize your project. We have this concept of like a project where you can organize your apps and so on, understand how to like use your keys, making sure nobody's like abusing them. So it's actually, yeah, it's obviously required, but at the same time, it's not like really like tricky. All that you need to do is like provide information on like what you want to do, even if it's like exploratory cases, right? So if somebody's a student, hey, I just want to try out this Twitter API, that's totally fine. You just have to say that's your use case, and then you can start using the Twitter API once you're approved. So yeah, it's actually required, and for according to the developer our policy. And I would highly like recommend, and like students and professors that want to like even just like do like exploratory cases. Yeah, it's really like not that tricky process.
Okay, thank you for, and following the next question is, and this question I think the person asked this question is like the R-Tweet package is compatible with the new version of the API.
Oh no, that's the thing, that right now it's not. That's actually why if in the demo, I actually use my own API call, right? I use the HTTR thing just to show you. And hopefully like we'll make these more samples available on our GitHub repository. But for now, it doesn't support, it only supports the old API, which like, unfortunately, that means that a lot of the cool new features are getting missed. But again, like you can always like, if you like know how to use the HTTR thing, then like it's just making an API call and specifying the parameters. But hopefully, I'm hopeful that like not just R-Tweet, but like I'm hopeful that other people in the R community that see value in these like new APIs, who knows, like somebody might be interested in making their own package, right? So that can be beneficial to like the entire community. I'm actually pretty passionate about it myself.
Yeah, I think like the Linux code were really cool actually with HTTR. So it's almost a package. You should just package it.
Yeah.
So now talking about language, I think a question was, is there a similar pipeline for Python?
Yeah. So there's one thing called Tweepy. Actually, let me share my screen once again. So there's a package called Tweepy that lets you do this, but obviously, again, the same thing, right? That Tweepy doesn't support. You able to see my screen, right? So this Tweepy is the library that supports like all of these things in Python. So you can like make the actual API call. Actually, let's look at one, right? I know status methods, right? So like API.update status and things like that. So it does the same thing. But we actually, for the V2 though, actually, yeah, this one. So for the V2, we actually make code samples available. So if you go to Twitter dev GitHub, right? github.com/Twitter dev. And if you go to Twitter API V2 sample code, you will see that for each of these new endpoints, right? We already have the code available. So let's look at recent search. So you'd see in Python, Java, excuse me, Node and Ruby. Hopefully I'll add code samples in R as well so that people can get started quickly. But yeah, for V1.1, you can use Tweepy, and V2, you can use this R sample code that we make available directly.
Awesome, thank you. I mean, it's really clear. So the next question is, I think you are filtering the data with language at some point. So like, is there any tweets that are not classified by any language, for example? Like,
yeah, I think there are some.
This metadata?
I think so, yeah. Actually, need to like go back. That's actually a really good question because I was recently thinking about it. I think there are like, I think it's UND. I don't know the exact thing, so I can't like quote it right now. But like there is some that might not be, or I think they might be, or maybe if it's like just like symbols, like some people, you know, like they'll use like smileys and Unicode characters, things like that. Yeah. So like those might, I think some of those are sometimes classified as like I think it's undefined or UND. I don't remember the exact one, but there are some cases. Yeah.
Thank you. That was a good question actually. So now two related question in one maybe is like, is there any limit on the size of the data you can get in a single day, or any limit in general? And I think someone asked also how long it would take if you want to download all the available data. So
yeah, so actually like actually there's no like specific answer in terms of like the volume itself, but like I can show you like how to like you can estimate it. So let me share my screen. So two different answers, right? So one is for the V2, right? It's pretty like straightforward, because if I go to actually for the V2, you have like 500,000 cap per month, right? So if you get tweets using recent search and using the filtered stream endpoint, then right now for beginners, you get 500,000 tweets per month. But that will change eventually, because now we'll have this idea of like elevated access. So if you're an academic, meaning like if you're a student at a university, PhD, like research institution, like a principal investigator, things like that, then you will actually, you can get elevated access. So you'll get much more tweets, but that's like something that's coming in the future. But as of today, there's only one basic package, because again, see, if you see here, it says early access, right? So this is for like just getting started with the new API. But eventually we'll have elevated access. So the answer for this one is 500K. But for the other, the 1.1, right, then you have to look at the individual limit. So each endpoint will have its own limit, right? So if I go to standard search API, if you look at API reference, for standard search API, right? So it'll actually tell you how many requests you can make. So in per 15-minute window, you can make 180 requests. If you're using like the user auth, and like if you're using app auth, which is the one that we use, then you can make like 450 requests. So this varies by endpoint. So there's no like magical solution, because like what happens if you're like using for like using certain keywords that don't bring back any tweets, right? So it also depends on like how good your filter is, meaning like how you made it like narrow enough to make sure that you're looking for exactly that data. But for in terms of the API request, then yeah, each of these endpoints, if you were to look at like users and so on, they will have their own rate limit that then you can like look for accordingly.
Thank you. And so maybe it's still related to that, I think, and it's also to related question, I think, is like, is there any type of like cost calculator that can help you estimate the total cost of downloading, for example, historical tweets? Or someone asked something similar, can you have the count of the data you will get if you want to find some tweet for a particular hashtag before downloading the data?
Yeah, actually, so if for that you will have to look at. So you remember I showed like the 3 different APIs. One was my standard API, a 1.1, then premium and enterprise. So actually, a premium API is obviously the one that's paid, right? And that actually has an endpoint called full archive search. So full archive, like I mentioned, you can go back and get like all tweets if you wanted. But then again, there are like limits to like how many tweets you can get with that. And also it gives you like a count endpoint, right? So /counts. So like before you actually download, so if you make a query saying that give me all tweets about Twitter, or like about a certain like few keywords that are not a retweet, that include are in this certain language, so on. But then instead of calling the actual recent search or the full archive search endpoint, you call the /counts endpoint. So that'll actually give you that, okay, this will return you this much data set. So first, then you'll be like, okay, then it makes sense for me to make this or no. And then obviously there are like different paid levels for that premium, because it's a premium endpoint right now. Then you have to like, based on like how many tweets you want back, then you can actually, like if you just search full archive search Twitter API, you'll be able to like see the pricing for it as well. And it'll show you that there's a /counts at the end of the same endpoint. It's full archive search /counts, but it'll tell you that how much data you're getting back.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. And another question, there's a lot, and I'm really sorry because we will not be able to ask all of them. So maybe another technical question is like, what is different between app and project in the API, I think?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah. So like you can think of, so project is where you're like keeping a track of you can almost think of like what you intend to do, right? So if you want to like, you have one project around for like misinformation or something like that, right? And then within that, you can like either you create a new app or existing app. So in the like most basic form, you can think of an app as a holder for holding your API keys and so on, right? And for tracking your usage. So if you make a certain call, then okay, we know that you made this call and that's coming from this app. So that way I know that, okay, it's coming from Suhem, who uses like API keys and so on. So it's basically, the easiest way of that is you can think of it that it's a container for your keys, the app, and then each project. Right now, one project has one app, obviously, though that's how it's configured right now. But eventually, like as like the platform evolves, then like they'll be like more handy. But for now, you can just think of it as like a holder for your app.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification. And someone else asked if it is possible to filter by location tweets.
Yeah, so there are like so again, I would point you to the same thing that I pointed earlier, that if you go to the here, search tweets, where to go? Let me share my screen.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so you see the different operators. So it tells you like geocode, so on. And then you'll be able to like, based on that, you can specify where you want the tweets from. This is for the old API, obviously, meaning the 1.1. So if I look for the search tweets under 1.1, excuse me, you'll be able to see it here using this geocode parameter.
All right. So thank you for the clarification. It makes sense. And I think also people are asking if some parameters are the same using the 2 versions of the API. One example is the limit. Are they the same for version 2 and version 1.1, or is there different? I think the limit of the number of tweets given a username, something.
No, yeah. So that's what I was saying, right? So the V2 actually has like a specific like limit on the basic, which is 500K tweets, and this is only tweets. So meaning only tweets that are coming from these 2 endpoints. So okay, this recent search and filtered stream, right? But let's say you wanted to hydrate. So if I give you 1 million tweets, for example, you want to hydrate, meaning you want to build the actual tweet object, then obviously you'll use this endpoint, tweet lookup, you see? And this obviously doesn't contribute towards your cap. So you can just like use it, you see? Which is different from like these 2, because the moment you'll actually like in your developer portal, then you can see that it tells you how many tweets you pulled so far, you see? So this is the V2. That's why you have the cap. But because of in the previous one, there's no concept of like a tweet cap per se. It's rate limits.
Okay. So thanks. And I think we have a question which is about ethics. Let me just find a question. So what are the key ethical consideration when someone applies to be a developer when they discuss the project?
Yeah, so actually, what I'll suggest is like two things, because like obviously we're at like time as well, and it's not like something that I can answer in like 2-3 minutes because it's like a really, really important question, right? But what I can do, like two things I'll consider, what I'll point you to is, one is if you go to developer.twitter.com, or even if you just did a Google search, Twitter developer policy, you can actually see we outline a policy of like what kind of use cases are allowed and what. Actually, we have a section. So actually, let me see if I can find it real quick. Give me 1 second. I'm looking for Twitter API. Don't have it handy, but like there's actually a section that talks about restricted. Oh yeah, right here. Let me share it. Yep. So you're able to see my screen. So if you see here, there's this complete section of like restricted use cases that you can like learn more about. Obviously, like I said, like it's not something I can answer in 2 minutes, but this would be like a good one for you to get started. And this was the thing that I was talking about, the developer policy. So these two will actually like answer some of those questions around restricted use cases.
Yeah, I wish we had more time, to be honest. And I think for the people that still have questions, I don't want to flood your mention, Suhem, but I think you already said that you can ask questions on Twitter. So
yeah,
please get his handle and ask him like about this technical question, or even not that technical, like the question about the ethics is really interesting. So thanks again, I mean, for your availability, for this amazing talk. And I don't know if there is a last one word or sentence, something you want to say.
No, I just wanted to tell you guys a thank you for having me, because I'm like I mentioned, I'm actually really passionate about the R community myself, and I really want to like see more people use both the Twitter data for research, specifically in R, and obviously like I'm hoping to like work with like more people to see like the evolution of like support for the new endpoints as we roll out in R, because these like the things that I talked about, like the context annotation, things like that, those are actually pretty powerful things. And like having that kind of support in R is actually going to like make like improve the quality of like analysis that people do with Twitter data in R. So yeah, thanks for having me. Super excited about this, the R community in general. And like I mentioned, if you have any questions, that's my Twitter handle on the screen. Feel free to reach out and I'll be more than happy to answer questions, and always welcome feedback.
Awesome. Thanks a lot for your time. The video will be available online on the YouTube channel. You can still follow the work of Suhem and Twitter dev in general. It was really amazing. And I think we're looking forward maybe for a part two, we dive into like maybe some particular topics.
Sure.
So thanks again for your time, and stay in touch. And a big thank you also for the YR conference for making, this amazing talk available. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.